I'd love to welcome our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience. We are live streaming and recording this program, so it will be available after as well. My name is Brean, and I am the Chief Curator and Director of Collections here at the Frick Pittsburgh, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a Curators conversation between myself and our esteemed guest, Aimee Ng. Welcome, Aimee.
Is your microphone on?
It might not be. Thank you for asking. Can you hear me a little better? There we go. Okay, that's good. Okay, it takes so many hands to mount an exhibition of this scale. So please join me in recognizing our presenting sponsors, the Eden Hall Foundation, the Richard C. Von Hess Foundation, and PNC, in partnership with an anonymous supporter, BNY Mellon Wealth Management, the Frick family, Barbara and David Burston, the Helen Clay Frick Foundation, Bob Hernandez and Karen Pluman, Mr. Kirk J. Johnson and Mr. Henry W. Krakowski Jr., Carol King and Chip Burke, Mrs. Catherine Lovner, People's Gas, Smithfield Trust Company, and UPMC Health Plan. We are grateful to all of our sponsors, including the Frick Fat Host Committee, and I encourage you to visit the webpage to see a complete listing of all of our supporters. And today, we are honoring our host committee members, Karen Jones-Arbitman and Michael Arbitman, for their generous support. So please join me in thanking them. Okay, well, I would welcome Aimee to come up on the stage with me if she's ready. Aimee is curator at the Frick Collection in New York. In 2020, she co-curated the Frick Madison's critically acclaimed installation of the Frick's historic collection in the Breuer Building on Madison Avenue. She has held curatorial and academic positions at the Morgan Library and Museum, where she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Morgan's Drawing Institute and at Columbia University, where she earned her Ph.D. She has contributed to numerous publications on the Frick Collection and is a bona fide celebrity, appearing on the award-winning YouTube series Cocktails with a Curator. With a Curator, what's her story and where in the world? Thank you for giving your time to us today. Aimee most recently curated Barclay L. Hendricks' Portraits at the Frick and is currently in the midst of a Herculean task of moving the collection out of the Frick Madison and back into the historic structure, which is set to open later this year, fingers crossed, when the renovations are complete. So the exhibition that we are hosting here, Vermeer, Monet, Rembrandt, Forging the Frick Collections in Pittsburgh and New York, is only possible because of that renovation project and with the support of our colleagues at the Frick Collection, including Aimee. They've approved a loan of 36 masterworks to travel to Pittsburgh at a time when the museum would otherwise be inaccessible to the public. And this has allowed us to showcase the collections of industrialist art collector Henry Clay Frick and his daughter, philanthropist Helen Clay Frick. I've always thought of the Pittsburgh and New York institutions as kind of two chapters of the same story. So it is such a pleasure to have a lot of these artworks almost have a homecoming back to Pittsburgh, where they initially were purchased and hung on the walls at Clayton, and then to tell a full story and give Helen her due. So you have seen the Frick Collection in so many different iterations. What was it like for you to see things in the gallery today?
First of all, I'm mostly just happy to be here. But is this thing on?
Yes.
Okay. It was a pleasure to step off the plane and come to beautiful Pittsburgh. And it was so interesting to step into the galleries and see old friends look very new. And we were talking a little bit, Dawn, about how just changing the location of a work of art changes entirely the way you look at it, the way suddenly you'll notice something different about it. And I don't want to bring this a little too lowbrow, but even when you change something in your house or apartment, you move a couch, you move a chair, suddenly the space changes. So it's like giving a new life to these objects. Every time you see it a little bit differently, the work of art itself almost gives something new. So that was really, we had a very quick walkthrough, but it was a very interesting experience of seeing this sort of historic collection brought together, but novel at the same time.
So we were able to reimagine the Frick collection a few different times. And I would love for you to tell us more about the process of planning for the presentation at the Frick Madison. That was truly a revelation to see your iconic collection in a completely very austere, the absolute opposite of.
Exactly. So the move into Frick Madison was occasioned by, of course, the renovation of the historic buildings, which were built 1913, 1914, and they just needed some work. The lesson of the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris really drove home the fact that having artwork in a active construction site was just too great of a risk, no matter what. So it was of absolute importance to us that we had to move our collection safely somewhere else. We were not out looking for a modernist gallery to suddenly reinvent the Frick. If you can imagine, that was not part of the trustees' interest in terms of shepherding the legacy of Hedwig Frick. We were seeking a solution. The crossroads were close the museum and put all of our art in storage for several years until the renovation was over. We decided traveling all of the works entirely over that several years was just not going to be safe for these objects that very rarely travel. And then renting, a gallery, a floor of the Guggenheim or something like this. Believe me, people came and offered these wonderful ideas. It was really because the Breuer building, which has had many iterations, it was built in 1966 by Marcel Breuer for the Whitney Museum of American Art. It was an icon of brutalist architecture. The Whitneys stayed there until they moved out into their own big building downtown, and they leased it to the Met, and that became the Met Breuer, where they would show a lot of their contemporary exhibitions. And then when that was no longer so feasible for the Met, it was not such a great idea to continue, and we were looking for a space. The Breuer building became a one-stop shop solution for storage, staff, works on view, 3 floors of gallery space, as well as just a curatorial challenge. And it's a very New York real estate story because we were subletting from the Met, who was leasing from the Whitney. And then when we finally vacate, Sotheby's has bought the building.
I have to ask, what surprised you the most about the process of curating for this space? Because it was a blank canvas in so many different ways.
It was a blank canvas. At the same time, Marcel Breuer's brutalist architecture is very loud and aggressive, and you can't ignore it. That gridded ceiling will follow you everywhere you go. You can try to make a curved wall, but the grid does not like that. And we were just talking as well in the Italian gallery over here at Frick Pittsburgh. You can try to put French paintings or but sometimes you have to just surrender to the architecture and just work with it. And so that's what we did. We ended up, the curators went on a curatorial retreat to Marfa, Texas, because we wanted to clear our minds and think about how does one respond to a site? You are given a site, you cannot change that site. How do you respond to the experience in that place? And we came home with really this surrender, this idea of just yielding to the Breuer architecture and seeing how one could harmonize rather than try to fight it or try to mask it. And there were many, many different proposals for the installation. This was not the first idea. In fact, we had some very long-time members and patrons who were adamant that we should recreate the Frick's interiors on the 3 floors of this modernist building, putting up the silk wall hangings, that kind of thing, because it was such a treasured, familiar place. And we ended up doing this because it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience to see things so completely different. What surprised me, how different things can look, how big the paintings look, and probably the most offensive thing, especially for our dealer friends, those who are really like deep in the art world, the offense of these big gilt frames outside of the sort of domestic Gilded Age mansion. they took on a life of their own, and especially for Dutch and Flemish works that are meant to have sort of austere black wood simple frames, these sort of, you know, Rothschild, Duveen, flowery frames took on a presence that they don't usually have in the house.
That makes so much sense, because we've been remarking as we were installing and opening all of the crates, every single frame has a different character. And I think even in our gallery spaces, they come alive a little bit more than they would in a historic house interior. Can you tell us more about the Bellini?
So there are two, on the left is Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis of the Desert. In the press, it's sometimes called the most beautiful Renaissance painting in America. You know, I don't know, maybe. I'll take that one. It's one of the most prized and treasured objects in the Frick's collection. It's a pilgrimage that even, you know, a lot of Italians make from Italy to come to New York to see this picture, painted in the 1470s in Venice. There were two trapezoidal windows in the Breuer building that would be used in a gallery setting. And there are no internal walls at the Breuer building, so every wall inside has to be built for the thing you're going to put in it. And so our very first decision was to make use of this window. One of the windows was going to Bellini, because in this picture, St. Francis is surrendering to the divine light, which is actually natural sunlight coming up in the left hand of his painting. For the first time in about 100 years, he's actually getting to face real natural light as well, because back in the mansion, the window's on the other side. So this was, he's alone, that painting is alone in this little chapel, and it was so contemplative of a setting that I had people, including the late Peter Sheldhall, who was art critic for the New Yorker for decades. He came and sat on the bench, and for 30 minutes, he just looked and said, I've been writing about this painting for 30 years, and I'm seeing new things in it. And that was, to me, one of the most gratifying things, not an encounter between somebody who had never seen the painting before, but somebody who thought he knew it so well could suddenly be discovering new things, just like in these galleries.
We've been talking about that earlier, and we've pulled out a number of paintings from Clayton, from the Historic House Museum on the other side of our campus, and there are artworks that I have looked at 1,000,001 times. I've been in that house almost every day for the past 8 years, and we've brought them out of the house, brought them into the gallery, lit them, and it was a brand new artwork. And I just have this newfound appreciation for so many of the works that are lost in the horror vacui of empty spaces, especially for Gilded Age interiors.
So I know you're supposed to be asking the questions, but my question is, if I could just flip for a second. So will the installation, as you've presented it here in the art museum, change the way that you will return to Clayton, in the sense of the relationship of the works of art, both in the galleries here and back in the house?
That's a really difficult question for us, because we have the great privilege of having a beautiful photo album of Clayton around 1901. So we do have a good idea of how the Frick family is living with those artworks. We have kind of documented spaces. That said, you know as well as I do that the Frick family wasn't living with them in exactly those spots. They were constantly changing. They were adding new things. I think we'll still have to think about that, but I will turn the question back to you and say, how does the experience of curating Frick Madison, has that played at all into your plans for moving back into the renovated Frick?
Yes, and a really important aspect of the renovation is that we're opening to the public for the first time the second floor of the historic house, which, if you've ever been to the Frick collection, you may have stood longingly at the base of the grand staircase and had a rope that just gently told you you were not welcome to the upstairs quarters. Those were, of course, the private quarters of the family when they had lived there. When the building was transformed into an art museum in 1935, they became the curatorial offices. So they were always going to be off view. We are opening them as a suite of about 10 rooms and some passages that will have art in them. They are not, however, period rooms. We don't have the beds, we don't have, it's not the same kind of lived spaces that we might have in Clayton. So we are, in a sense, curating and making plans for installation in totally new historic sites, if that makes sense. It's sort of a complex mix of new and old. What I get asked this all the time, what are the lessons of Frick Madison that you could possibly bring back to the house? I mean, the two things just seem so incongruent. One thing that all of the curators really embraced was that sometimes empty space around an object can feel full, and it can activate an object in ways that adding curtains and sculpture and a chair and passementerie, all of that stuff might not actually add more. Sometimes space can do a lot for you. So we find little instances to let works of art breathe differently than they might in the more familiar spaces of the first floor. That's all I'm saying. I'm on a press embargo.
I really love that idea, and I could probably take that lesson because I am a maximalist at heart. I love a good Victorian interior. I love too much texture, too many things in one space. So I think if anything, one of the lessons that we might learn from this exhibition and pulling things out of the house is to maybe do that more frequently with some highlight focus installations where you can appreciate a work of art that you don't have that experience with when you're on an hour-long tour of the historic house and you're going through the rooms. It's really easy to miss some of these. So to give our visitors opportunities to sit with those.
It's also the secret power of the curator. You know, it's kind of evil, but we can kind of shape the way that visitors either stop at or keep passing by. I mean, sometimes, you know, there are many factors that go into how and why we put something together the way that we do. But for example, that Bellini in the room by itself, if we put 4 other things in there, I don't know that people would stop and sit for 30 minutes in front of that picture and see. So it really is the way you shape the experience. And that I take that responsibility very, very deeply, because if we're meant to be, and the Frick, one of the elements of our mission in New York is to get people to look closely and to preserve the historic tranquility of the house at the same time. That kind of slowing down and looking closely, that is our job to protect that experience as well.
I might be wrong, but I think today is Looking Slowly Day for art museums. Lizzie is nodding, so I think I'm right. So hopefully we will encourage everyone to make one more cycle through the exhibition and find something and just look and find something new in it. I would love to go back and talk a little bit more about historic houses and art collections. So here at the Frick Pittsburgh, we have both. Clayton, the Historic House Museum, where Frick and his wife Adelaide are raising their children, living between 1883 and 1905. And then, of course, the Frick Art Museum, which is founded by Helen in 1970 to house her personal art collection. She is so tied into the design and the choice of materials that she really wanted a specific visitor experience, and that was to echo the domestic interiors that her father had built at the Frick collection. And she's so successful at that I have overheard a number of visitors giving their own tour and very confidently saying, yes, this was the Frick family home. And then it was turned into a museum, because I think that our building as an art museum is really challenging for visitors to come into. It's not a house, it's not a museum, it's trying to be one thing, but it feels like another sometimes. But of course, the Frick collection is also in between, because this is a private family residence, but from the beginning, right, Frick intends for it to eventually become a museum open to the public. So how does that thought, or does that thought, play into how you think about the house or when you're interpreting the collection?
In terms of installation. Well, one of my favorite things to say when I'm giving a tour of the house, in 1914, when the Frick family moved into it, many wealthy New York families had a ballroom, but the Fricks had a picture gallery. And so it was built into the priorities of the legacy of this family. We don't know exactly when he made the decision in his mind, but 1915 is the date of the will that bequeaths his collection and the house to public museum. But as Dawn is mentioning, when Adelaide Childs Frick dies, his wife survives him, and she dies in 1931. It takes several years for this transformation of a house with bathrooms and closets and I wish I still had the ensuite bathroom to my office, but those things were taken away because for administrative offices, those spaces were all kind of changed. The addition of the garden court, the oval room, the east gallery, there are a number of rooms that were not original to the house and that Henry Clay Frick never saw. But it's always been part of the legacy to try to make that transition as seamless as possible so that you can mark change, but that it's a coherent space. In terms of the installation, there are things that work and things that don't. From historic pictures, some things, the giant Turners were in these very small hallways when the family lived there. And that's just, now they anchor the big picture gallery, the West Gallery. When we think about when Frick was collecting, he bought the plot of land that would become the Frick collection, 1906-ish. So, but he doesn't start construction because they have to dismantle other things, and he doesn't move in until 1914. The whole time that he's buying, between that and him moving in 1914, he's renting, again, New York City story, renting from the Vanderbilts. So he's actually living in someone else's furnished home, building a collection in a rented space, imagining how it would look in the house he would only live in for 4 years. So 5 years. So to me, what you're talking about in terms of the freedom, things do move around. It's not a place where time stands still for the Frick, even though people think that they come to the Frick and it's the same thing every time. Things do move, and they did when the family lived there too. And I think that's an important freedom to have, unlike the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, for example. We don't have the restriction of, you cannot move this painting from this space or this spoon from this table. Luckily, we do have that freedom and the flexibility to sort of evolve the house as well.
I think so many people have always thought of the Frick collection, purely as a product of Frick himself. But in reality, so many different people played a part in the formation of that institution, including his indomitable daughter. That is always how I choose to describe her. Part of our interest with this exhibition was to pull Helen out as an independent agent of her own and to recognize what a role she played in the early acquisitions of the Frick collection after her father's death. Just like you said, he never saw certain galleries. There are beloved artworks that are associated with the Frick collection that he never saw, never laid eyes on, and may never have bought in his lifetime. So how will you be pulling her into the story?
Well, part of the reason we're so grateful for this collaboration here and this exhibition that's been put together so beautifully is that it does bring the story out from that sort of single founder, Henry Clay Frick. As great of a collector as he was, in fact, Helen played a longer part, in fact, in shaping the collection after his death. If you can imagine, the time she spent as head of the acquisitions committee of the Frick collection was longer than he was collecting himself. So it's wonderful to be able to bring her out. We have tried to make the second floor spaces, because it's kind of like a blank slate a little bit. We wanted to let the histories of those rooms dictate a little bit of the stories we were going to tell up there. So, for example, as one of the big stories in these galleries say, it was Helen who brings in the great Italian Renaissance, the early gold round pictures like Duccio, Cimabue, Piero della Francesca. These are extremely valuable pictures now. They were not of interest to her father, but she was the one bringing them together. So we will install a group of them in what had been her former bedroom, sort of to pay tribute to her place, the site, that presence of Helen in this building.
That'll be fascinating. I can't wait to see.
Was I allowed to tell? No, I'm just kidding. I can that went out in a press report. That's okay.
Let's see. So, as single collector institutions, as we talk about Helen and Henry, both the Frick collection and the Frick Pittsburgh are so indelibly linked to our founders in a lot of ways, and I think maybe more so at Pittsburgh than New York. We could argue that point a little bit. But if we're thinking about Clayton in particular, that because we are here in Pittsburgh, we are in the location where Frick built his wealth, which he was able to amass this astounding art collection because he was exploiting workers and the land and building this astonishing fortune basically on their backs. And so for us, as we look at the Historic House Museum, it's about so much more than the art. It is about the Gilded Age in full and the Frick family's role within that larger story. Whereas I feel like everyone has always thought of the Frick collection as an art museum, but not a historic house museum.
Exactly, and even the fact that the word collection is in the title of this institution, the focus is on the objects. The objects have a name, but it really is about the collection that in a sense overshadows the life of this family. It really is about the Vermeer and the Rembrandt and the Bellini and the Titian. The other thing is, Frick and the Frick name obviously has a very, very different resonance in New York City than it does here in Pittsburgh. And there, by the time he moves to New York, he's retired. He's a philanthropist. He's there he's trying to get on the board of the Met. There, he's building a collection that's trying to compete with J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts, and really trying to compete in the sense of society, not amassing the wealth that would lead to also his name being on so many more sites and buildings in this city, as opposed to that sort of singular domestic space in the Frick at New York.
Trying to follow that up with a question, I can't. That's okay. It is very different to talk about Frick here in Pittsburgh than in New York. And I think a lot of why his legacy survives as a philanthropist and why so many people outside of Pittsburgh think of him not as the industrial tycoon, but as a philanthropist, is because Helen was really successful in shaping his legacy as an art collector and a philanthropist. Recently reading through obituaries after Frick's death, and there are only a handful that mention his dispute with Andrew Carnegie, that mention the Homestead lockout and strike. It's really, really astonishing. They focus purely on his philanthropy, and he really was, by building this art collection, able to kind of whitewash his reputation, and Helen's efforts contributed to that.
And meanwhile, in the Frick on Fifth Avenue, not the Frick building here in Pittsburgh, but the Frick collection on Fifth Avenue, New York, it's considered, it was meant to be at the time that it opened, a modest house. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's actually in the papers as he's instructing the architects and the interior designers. No, we don't want all this sort of sculpted ceilings and gilded this. We want it to be modest. And a really important thing is if you're ever standing on Fifth Avenue looking up or down, it is the only house that's pushed back from the sidewalk. There's a whole bit of land, there's a garden that sets the house back. And if you can imagine in 1915, when all of the wealthy family homes were right up on the sidewalk, really imposing their presence on the passersby, to have something set back like this, that understatement, it was a really intentional effect of somebody who's not trying to assert their presence and identity, even if it does have that opposite effect. Like, they're so rich that they push the house back.
We often use the word modest to describe Clayton as well, and I'm fully sitting here appreciating how many of you are thinking, absolutely not. Nothing about that family was modest in any way. So I'm interested if you can tell us anything more about
Where did you get these?
renovations.
No, just kidding. These are
From his website.
These are official renderings that Cellar of Architects has released and has circulated widely. The left is a rendering of the special exhibition galleries, so that no longer will we have to remove the permanent collection from the Oval Room and East Gallery in order to mount paintings shows. There will be devoted galleries for temporary exhibitions. And on the right is a view, you have ascended the grand staircase. You are there on the landing. If you didn't make it up the stairs, there are special new large elevators that can get you there as well. And this is a treat for everyone. I mean, even myself, who has been up and down these steps many times, I've never seen these rooms installed in the way that our little paper models will, try to give an idea of how we're going to do it. I'm excited to see. I'm excited to climb those steps and be greeted with the enfilade views into these galleries.
I've definitely been among those who are lingering at the bottom of the stairs, dying to go up. Amanda Gillen, our director of education, was telling a story recently of how she was doing research at the Frick Art Reference Library, and someone walked her up the staircase so that she could see the upper office floors, and she was like, oh, that's so important. So we are all going to experience that when we make our way up that staircase.
Well, and that is a really important part of this. We're not going to change. We can't, it's a landmark building. We're not going to change the front of the Frick collection so that there's a neon sign that says everyone welcome. I mean, heads would roll. But what we can do, and especially to so many of the audiences that we've gained being at Frick Madison, are people who have never been to the mansion before. They met us at Frick Madison. And I'm really excited to welcome them back and welcome them for the first time into the historic house. And they will, like anyone else, feel welcome to come up to the second floor. That is, I think, a very big gesture of accessibility in the sense that you don't get that velvet rope saying, you're a special guest, which even during the lifetime of the family, when they were in residence, that was a threshold that only special guests would also be crossing. So, it's a historic threshold that I'm really excited to be overcoming.
So one thing that the Frick Madison really allowed you to do was, in your contemporary building, to also play with contemporary art in the historic collection. And I feel like contemporary art is a great inroad for our public in looking at a historic collection, because I think as much as some people view these artworks as masterpieces and the big names, I think there are also people who we want to see in our museum who might not see themselves in them or might not feel the connection. And so I think contemporary art is a great way to kind of bridge that. The Barclay Hendricks show, I will forever be sad that I did not get to see in person, but I'd love to hear your experience curating that show in that space, and if you are thinking about ways to bring contemporary art into that.
So contemporary art is a really great way to open up the collection to audiences who might not already be interested in 17th century Dutch pictures, for example. But of course, it's not the only way. And the Frick, as you can imagine, is one of the last standing institutions that is really devoted to historic European art. So we find as many ways as we can, both expanding histories and every so often having contemporary voices illuminate something about the historic collection. And for decades, we've had a lecture series at the Frick called Artists, Poets, and Writers, which highlighted all the people who would come through New York and find inspiration in the historic works of the Frick in their own contemporary works. So there's always been a relationship to makers in terms of the Frick collection and its programming. When we moved into the Breuer building and we moved into Frick Madison, one thing became very clear. People were looking at paintings and objects, but especially paintings, because they were lowered down, there was no class, there were no barriers. I had students from the Art Students League and other art schools in the city say, this is the best place to study painting right now. People would just sit and do their drawings or look very closely, because suddenly the access to paintings was very clear. And more artists were coming in and telling us, actually, I've always been coming in, now you're just seeing me more, which is also funny, because they kind of, you can't stop and sketch that often in the house. It's very conspicuous, but in a museum, purpose-built museum like the Breuer building, it's so natural, you don't even notice it. So the relationship of the Frick's historic collection with contemporary artists became so apparent to us. We started to exploit what is more obvious in a modernist setting than it is in the house. And we sought a few contemporary artists to find new ways to look at our historic collection, always with the idea that the core of our mission is to illuminate these centuries-old objects. Barclay Hendricks was a Pennsylvania artist born in Philadelphia. And the reason why he was perfect for the Frick, he passed away in 2017. The Frick was his favorite museum in the United States. In 1966, when he was an art student at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, he won a fellowship to Europe. And he traveled for 3 months as a 21-year-old kid to all the major cities. So he went to the National Gallery in London, the Louvre in Paris, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, Uffizi in Florence, et cetera, et cetera. And he opened his eyes and saw both things he loved, which is old master painting, grand manner style, portraiture, and as a young Black American, he obviously saw things missing as well. So not only that there were few depictions of people of color in these works of art, but that those that he did see were not personalized, humanizing portraits of Black figures, but the servant, the Black sage, that kind of thing. So he came back, and this is 1966. He comes back and he starts a series of portraits of people in his life. This is his cousin, Kathy Williams, but inspired directly by the old master paintings that he saw. So obviously early Italian Renaissance paintings, like the gold ground pictures with the Madonna. Her afro suddenly takes on a halo quality. The gold back there, it took him 2 years to learn how to actually use gold leaf with bowl, because he was practicing with cheaper materials, because once you screw it up, you lose the gold. So throughout, the show is relatively small. It was 14 paintings from 1969 to the latest one was 1983, when he virtually stopped painting portraits for about 20 years. And they were these connections with the Frick and its historic collection, because when I say that the Frick was his favorite museum in the United States, for him, it was like the Louvre of Paris. And so it meant a lot to visitors who are in love with Barclay's pictures. And this was amazing. The New York Times critic who came and did a walkthrough with me before his review, we were talking about gold leaf, we were talking about Byzantine and early Italian Renaissance painting. And he had not spent much time, or maybe he hadn't really encountered early Italian Christian painting before. So we went down to the 3rd floor and we stood in front of a Duccio and a Gentile da Fabriano, and he suddenly saw 13th century paintings through the lens of Barclay Hendricks in 1969. And that to me was a truly gratifying moment, not because, oh, I taught somebody something, but that contemporary art can be a window into very old things, just like it can go the other way around. So I think you have a couple of other installation shots, but just to see that, those whistlers, those whistlers in the back are 1880s. And then the two flanking pictures are the early 1969 on the left and 1983 on the right. Girlfriend, wife.
So can you tell us if you have any plans for other contemporary artists?
This is the second most asked question to me, but it's an important one because I think, especially just fiscally speaking, this being the very first contemporary paintings exhibition that we've had at the Frick Collection, it was fanatically well attended. I mean, it broke records for us, and of course, that it begs the question of how does that open the avenue to the future? How does that affect our even fiscally responsible decisions? Do we go back to just 12th century ivory carvings? We do everything in the Frick way, which is we choose things that are right. We are not a contemporary institution. I have a Ph.D. in Italian Renaissance painting. Every so often, an artist comes along and it's right. And that is what we will embrace. There are so many institutions that are churning out contemporary shows in New York City alone. We do not need to be actively adding to that endless schedule of 3 shows a year contemporary art. But when it's right, we will do it right. And that is the very true answer. There's nothing behind that.
Well, I know our visitors probably have a ton of questions for you, so I want to open it up if anyone has questions for Aimee
Or you.
or me or both of us. But maybe while you're formulating your questions, I will ask you one more. What are you most excited about over the next year?
Opening. I just want the new experience of the old place back again. And I endearingly call it going back to the future, because we are going to this historic place, but we're not going back in time. We're going back to the sort of a future chapter. And I don't know what it looks like yet. You know, we can plan, we have all our 3D models, we have the paper, we have the maquettes, but I want to experience it along with everybody else, because you know, there's nothing like the real thing. You walk into that gallery and it will feel something new.
Thank you. Anyone out there have questions?
Are there any plans, I mean, given the success of the current exhibition, of any future collaborations with the Frick in New York and in Pittsburgh?
There are. I don't think they're under lock and key. I think there's probably an important large-scale loan that we have historically never let out of our campus that might be headed their way. You guys are getting a sneak peek in the Monet Gallery of a potential project in a few years. I know there's a number of other things. I think the relationship between the two institutions, I've been at the Frick for 9 years, and I feel like from when I started to now, it's a completely different relationship of the institution. So I hope it is only at the beginning.
So I have the best job in the world. When people ask me what I do, I say I take care of works of art, but mostly I do things with friends. And we are very happy about this collaboration and just the way that it sheds light on both institutions. And I think that is the important thing, is that new stories are told just by bringing things together. So we are always on the lookout.
We also have an idea for other Frick residences that don't survive anymore, of which we have some shared collections. So Eagle Rock, there's a number of other things we could be tackling together.
And now you have to sign an NDA.
Could you talk about the placement of pictures in this right-hand side?
Yeah, sure. Oh, thank you. This is one of my favorite vistas. So right off the elevator, the first thing you'd see was the gold ground that was on the previous slide. Lottie Mama was called with the afro halo. And then you turn to the side, and I wanted to make sure that people had in their mind what Barclay was dealing with before he came along. Because, and I'll backtrack to say, a lot of people came to the exhibition and said, but how is this different from Kehinde? And Kehinde wasn't born when Barclay was painting Lottie Mama. Like, he wasn't there yet. And so I wanted just a little passage, because we didn't intersperse Barclay's work throughout the collection. We gave him the dignity of his own gallery. So Lottie Mama was on her own, but after this little room, there are 2 galleries devoted entirely to Barclay's portraits. But this small little, there were 4 British portraits, 2 Gainsborough, 2 Reynolds, just to give a sense of, you know, what were the stakes? What was he going up against in the sense of the traditions of portraiture that he was encountering and turning on their head. And on the right is Sir Joshua Reynolds' portrait of General John Burgoyne, who famously lost the battle at Saratoga, allowing the Americans to have victory there. So he's a big loser. But when that portrait was made, he was a big winner. This is previous to that defeat. And he, on this 4th floor of the Word Building, used to have the brightest, cherriest red jacket on the entire floor. And then Barclay came in, and beyond there is a painting called Blood, which that bright red is acrylic. You always put acrylic, flat, really bold paint in the background, and then oil paint in the old master style for the figure in the front. And so it was this sort of, a battle of colors in a way. It was a response in color. And it's a 1973 painting. And amazingly, the sitter of that painting came in and was reunited with his picture. This never happens in the Italian Renaissance.
That is the joy of working with living artists. David.
I just wanted to say, I was able to make it to the Frick Madison, and it was just astonishing. It was just amazing to see those paintings with no clutter and just on a wall. It was just wonderful, and the Barclay Hendricks it was so spectacular. I wish everybody could have seen it. I loved it. I loved the juxtaposition of the old and the new. It was wonderful. And Dawn, I was just wondering if you think we'll ever have Barclay Hendricks come to our.
Why not?
Wonderful.
I would love that. I think in a very similar vein, we are always interested in contemporary artists who are looking at the past, who are looking at artists' techniques or different genres and reinventing them in new ways. I share a slide here of Vanessa German's installation in the Italian Gallery, which we closed just before this installation, but this is one of the most stunning exhibitions I ever had the pleasure of working on with an artist, having her devotional altarpieces within a gallery of Italian Renaissance paintings. I think I looked at those Italian Renaissance paintings with a completely new eye, because I do not have a PhD in art history. I come from material culture and decorative arts. So I had a newfound appreciation for those works of art and for Vanessa within that space. So it's hard to imagine the Italian Gallery without this installation, but I am so grateful we had it for the time that we did. And I'm thankful and making space for whatever might come next.
Aimee, we watched every single one of your classes on Curator, and after they ended, it was got to be Fridays at 5 o'clock, and we thought, what do we do? So I hope you might do something similar again when you reopen, because they were so wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Could you walk us through the process of who came up, like where did the seed start? Who made the first phone call to get you guys together in the collaboration? How did that happen?
It's, like I said, it's the work of many, many hands, curator to curator, director to director, trustees. There's a lot of tact and diplomacy that went on behind the scenes. And I think when the news was official that the renovation was going to happen, our executive director at the time, Robin Nicholson, reached out to Ian Wardroper, their director, to say, well, if the artworks are going to be in storage, why we could host them for a little while. And that was the initial foray. And from there, we opened a conversation. We were pleasantly surprised and delighted that you were open to this, and the fact that you all entrusted us to care for these artworks for this time here in Pittsburgh. The opportunity for it here is amazing.
But selfishly, we gain a lot by collaborating in this way. I mean, the new research that you're doing, especially in the collecting history, even just juxtapositions of paintings that remained in the Frick family and didn't come to the Frick collection. These paintings will come back with newness, with new discoveries as well. So it's a very selfish thing to have been so generous.
Can you confirm that the window beside the Bellini's St. Francis is protected glass?
It is not only protected glass, it has a scrim that blocks a certain amount of UV, as any museum window should.
Technology is a wonderful thing. Other questions? I thought I saw him.
One of the wonders of Frick Madison was the porcelain all being in one place. Is that going to influence how you display it when it moves back to the house?
Yeah, and the porcelain room at Frick Madison, thank you for bringing that up. It seemed really modern. It had a very formal almost installation, because it was grouped by color. and then a composition of objects, small objects, was made on different walls. It's actually a historic installation. So in the 18th century, Augustus Strong, the Elector of Saxony, he created a Japanese pavilion, and he grouped his porcelain by color, and made these compositions on the wall. So it is an idea actually that wasn't, let's say, invented at Frick Madison. I'm glad and I agree that it was a very effective one, and it made people look first at the whole composition on the wall, and then on the strange elephant that's actually a wine dispenser. The wine comes out of the nose. So it did, you know, it was a means of discovery, and certainly that historic idea will find another incarnation back in the mansion. Thanks.
No other questions. I see one more. We'll take one more.
So, we heard Hernan Diaz speak the other night. He was talking about gilded, not golden. And he also mentioned something about Adelaide Brean, and he had gone to the library of Frick in New York and done some research into her papers that had not been open for 20 years. So I just wonder, is anybody doing any more research on Adelaide? Did she have any part in creating this collection?
Such a good question. We were talking about this as we did a brief walkthrough just before. Adelaide is endlessly fascinating to me because she's not allowed presence in the historical record. We really don't know what role she played in all of the artworks that were coming into Clayton in the 1890s and the early 1900s. Is she, you know, yes, no, or is she just like, oh, there he goes again, hanging paintings on the windows and in front of the doors and blocking all my access to different rooms? We really have no idea. But as part of this, we were looking through our own curatorial records and kind of questioning some things that we had taken as fact and saying, why have we always said this, and is it actually true? And we were able to look through papers at the Frick Art Reference Library and discover that Adelaide had actually purchased the Sacetta, the gold ground painting that is paired with the Rembrandt self-portrait in the Brean Gallery. And that was kind of a revelation to us because she suddenly appeared in this story. So there are people who are doing some research into her. We will be hosting a symposium on Thursday, June 6th, where we'll be inviting a number of scholars who are researching Frick, Helen, the Gilded Age collecting in general, women dealers, women artists from the period. And so we're hoping to learn more about her and more about others. That is the endless joy of our job, is that we don't know it all. You know, you think sometimes that you know everything there is to know about an artwork or a family or a figure. We couldn't be more wrong, and we are always discovering new exciting things every day. Well, it is Saturday, not Friday, but it is 5, so we can adjourn for a cocktail with our curator. Thank you all so much for being here.